Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be finally talking about the newest album from Kanye West, titled The Life of Pablo. There's no easy way to talk about Kanye West. At first, it was a little bit easier back in the 2000s. The first three records hold up as some of the best hip-hop of that decade. Excellently produced with a flow that was frequently clumsy and kind of forced, but had enough interesting ideas and personality to make up for it most of the time. But I'll also be the first to admit that I wasn't really won over by those albums. Solid, sure, but the braggadocious side of Kanye has always rung a little bit hollow to me. Something that he wants to believe in his worship of Jay-Z about himself rather than something that actually clicks on a deeper level for him. So while I liked Kanye initially, it wasn't those albums that actually initially won me over. That came with 808s and Heartbreak, which I'd argue hit me harder as a whole than any album he's ever released. The usage of auto-tune as a method to distance himself from the audience and his own emotions, an underappreciated gift for melody, and lyrics that tap into an unflattering but powerfully human heartbreak that felt more real than most of the flash of his previous three records. Then came the VMAs in 2009, and Kanye saw himself vilified by pretty much the entire world. So he ripped away the smokescreen to make My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy in 2010, a record of which I've got the contentious opinion of having simultaneously some of the best and worst songs of Kanye's discography. Some great cuts and very evocative images let down by some sloppy indulgence and some half-formed ideas. It's also a record that snapped into focus the picture of who Kanye is as an artist. A world-famous and gifted artist to be sure, who is yet monumentally insecure and cares way too much, a lot more than he should. Who has enough distance from his life to write with unflinching detail and perfect framing about it, but not enough to filter his emotions or outrageous thoughts before he says or does something completely asinine. Now that all got amped up to 11 with Yeezus in 2013, where he consciously chose to embody all the negative stereotypes that he initially painted on his last album, but as such, it felt far less convincing. It was a stereotype, it wasn't real. Part of this is that Kanye is a consummate borrower, starting with sampling as a producer to the appropriation of whole styles like on Yeezus, where he essentially sounded like a low-rent Death Grips and he wasn't doing it very well. As such, I tend to find my liking for Kanye tends to fluctuate more of his influences that I hear. I admire his production and his ability to paint some vividly unsettling pictures using the foundation of commercial hip-hop. Hell of a Life and Blood on the Leaves are the two best examples of that. And yet his sloppy flow, his corny references, his frequently uneven vocals, and occasionally outright misfire makes him hard for me to really appreciate and get behind as a fan. As such, watching the build-up to this new Kanye release was kind of fascinating, at least before it started becoming actively exasperating and really kind of infuriating. Not only did the album title change 3 or 4 times, along with the track listings and album art and Kanye's off-kilter Twitter providing more fuel for the fire, it seemed more like Kanye didn't know what to give us as an audience. It certainly didn't show any indication of coherent artistic vision, especially considering the track listing and the album art was being changed not only up to the intended release date, but right past it and onto the last weekend. Whatever, Kanye's long ago reached the point where critics and his die-hard fans will furiously masturbate over whatever he puts out, and then retracts then to release later. So what did we get with The Life of Pablo? Well, to some extent, I got exactly what I was expecting, because The Life of Pablo is a complete goddamn mess in terms of instrumentation and vocal performances, to say nothing of the actual content. Say what you will about Yeezus, for as over-the-top as it was trying to be, it was at least sonically and thematically consistent. Whereas here, the most I got out of this record is that Kim Kardashian now has her most damning piece of evidence when she finally gets sick of Kanye West's antics and divorces him. And I actually don't mean that as a joke. That's actually kind of intentional into the themes of this record. Before I get to that though, I think I need to highlight this record's real positives, because there are indeed a few. For one, Kanye does have a good record of giving his guest stars a real place to shine. And between Kendrick Lamar's verse on No Parties in LA, the few moments where Dolla shows up, especially on Real Friends where it sounds really good with the layering and the vocals, Chris Brown actually sounding pretty solid on Waves, The Weeknd easily being the best part of FML, and Chance the Rapper pretty much stealing the entire song on Ultralight Beam, these are great moments. Hell, even Post Malone sounds good in a screaming through auto-tune sort of way on Fade. It's certainly more preferable to the rambling garbage of White Iverson, and points must be given for Kanye using Young Thug in probably the most agreeable way, putting him on the hook where the damage is minimalized. And Rihanna sounds better on the hook of Famous than on many points of her last album, Anti, with a ton of personality and poise singing over a Nina Simone chorus. Kind of transgressive there, but she sounded great. And hell, after Speeding Bullet to Heaven, I'll give Kanye West credit for getting Kid Cudi not to make something atrocious out of his hook on their song. All that being said though, there are a few spots where the guests kind of took away from the song. The first being Swiss Beats playing Hype Man over Famous when it really wasn't needed, which was then preceded by Good Music's new assignee Designer doing a Future impression that makes it very clear that Kanye West couldn't afford Future for this album. The most disappointing and wasteful usage of a guest star, though, came with Andre 3000, 3-Stack, showing up on 30 Hours, basically to play Hype Man for Kanye, rambling through a shout-out, half-improvised bonus track, where I'm fairly certain he takes a call mid-song. That's how little he cares. Now, I'm highlighting all these guest stars for one main reason. Oftentimes, they've got more presence on these songs than Kanye does. There are quite literally interludes and segments where Kanye doesn't show up vocally on these songs at all. And even when he does, it's no guarantee that he's actually going to be rapping. Now, I don't mind Kanye's auto-tune singing on occasion, but placed in contrast on so many places with actual bars, it just rarely carries the same impact without the cohesion and tone, especially when he actually does have some decent flows pulled from Drake and Kendrick Lamar, but they still sound good. On the other hand, there's still a part of Kanye who wants to keep trying bad impressions of modern MCs that sound like the worst part of Yeezus Leftovers, and the auto-tune is definitely not helping him sound imposing or even all that interesting. Mostly because we've heard much of this delivery before and it wasn't good then. It's probably worse than the repurposed remix of Facts that for some ungodly reason shows up near the end of this album. Kanye, you don't have the voice for this sort of yelling. It's more laughable when you try it than anything else. Of course, his production doesn't always do him a lot of favors either, where more than ever before, the patchwork nature of the samples and the bass-heavy fragments leads to a record that rarely ever builds to a consistent groove or flow, none of which is helped by tracks either feeling far shorter or far longer than they ever need to be. Makes the album feel kinda lumpy and leaden in spots. And this frustrates me because for the most part, there are some inspired production moments and nuances that I really like. The little horn piece on Ultralight Beam, the warped Nina Simone sample on Famous, or that choppy gospel vocal sample on Waves filled with echoing howls that have some real punch against that trap beat, especially as they get a little bit deeper with the vocals. Hell, on the topic of vocal samples, the Arthur Russell sample on 30 Hours, that superb sample of Junie Morrison on No Parties in LA, thanks for Madlib for producing that one, plus throwing in a sample from Drake's father of all things, and also kind of giving the song a Beyond the Valley of the Dolls feel that I really liked, and the great groove on Fade, a pretty damn propulsive Rare Earth sample. Sure, it's later chopped up with a shrill fragment from Barbara Tucker that I really don't think works that well at all, but it got closer than most, but it highlights how much of this record feels micromanaged, clashing samples off each other for scattershot ideas rather than cohesive songs, which I'd be much more willing to support if the flow and underlying mood was consistent. My big example for me is Father Stretch My Wings Part 2, which takes a much more propulsive and dark Metro Boomin beat that Kanye actually rides pretty well, and then out of nowhere, we get Carolyn Shaw doing her best Imogen Heap impression for a couple seconds before a sudden lurch back in the gospel. I get the montage intention, but in this case, it's compromising the foundation of the actual song. It just completely disrupts it. And on another note, for as much as this album touches into gospel and makes me wish I was listening to Algiers again, the absolute worst parts of the instrumentation comes in tracks like Feedback and Freestyle 4. Not because they're obvious Death Grips rejects circa government plates, and even then, they feel more painfully derivative of the style that Kanye tried to use on Yeezus, and they're all the more jarringly out of place here. They don't fit, especially a song like Feedback with that glaring synth tone that sounds terrible. And it's not just the beats or the production, it's the content too. And here's where we get into the ugliest parts of this review, because there will be a lot of hardcore fans of Kanye West, emphasis on hard of course, who will claim that I just want Kanye to go back to his backpacker days and that he's not always trying to be lyrical. And while I'd argue that the best moments of insight on this record come when he's in that more lyrical backpacker zone, Real Friends, No Parties in LA both spring to mind here, the larger issue comes in that so much of the content, even when he's not lyrical, so much of the controversy that he's trying to drum up to feels flagrantly redundant and recycled. Self-deprecating bragging about fame that doesn't even hit the transcendent moments at its best and frequently skids into corniness. The most obvious examples are Feedback and Freestyle 4, which are trying to be New Slaves and Hell of a Life Part 2, but they at least put together a reflective picture that runs throughout this entire album as Kanye mines through his legacy for something that could actually produce a decent song. I honestly don't even care about the Taylor Swift reference on Famous for its blatant dickishness, and more because it was over 7 years ago, and Kanye's still not over this. I'll give Facts this, for as asinine as that song is and how bad it sounds, at least for me, it at least feels marginally original in terms of its content, and that most controversial that I'd argue Kanye gets, probably on Highlights of all things, where he tells black guys to go after white girls so they can have more black babies. Yeah, not touching those implications of the 10-foot pole, especially considering how Kanye also references the Nation of Islam on that track. Yikes. And while I'll give Kanye a bit of credit for taking the piss out of his own ego on I Love Kanye, his insecurity is much more revealing on feedback, where he questions why he'd even let himself get bothered by critics and bloggers, where it's very clear that he is still bothered by them, showing his own massive insecurity here. But let's be honest here, that's peripheral to the central relationship and theme of this album, if you can remotely call it that, and that's Kanye's marriage to Kim Kardashian. And as I said earlier, if Kim wanted evidence for divorce proceedings, this record is probably the best that she could hope for, not just because of Kanye's monumental insecurity that underscores this album, but also at the many times he spends reflecting on previous relationships, with ways putting through the subtext that those feelings and emotions for previous girls never really die. Now, the best moments are paradoxically when this record gets the most depressing, like on the self-flagellating Real Friends, the best track on the album, not just for its honesty, for how Kanye admits that he's lost friends since he's dated and married Kim, a woman that he does believably love. And I like The Weeknd's implication in FML, where Kanye might be trying to put aside his hoes to be with Kim, but The Weeknd seems to expect that a relapse is kind of inevitable, and that's a real human moment, even though he'll say that the only person that can judge him is himself. And yet on tracks like Wolves, Kanye tries to place Kim and himself in the Joseph and Mary analog. But the final lines from Frank Ocean implies sort of burnout in the face of the wolves that surround them and the wildness that consumes them both from within. If nothing else, I can appreciate the undercurrent of depression on this album, frequently referenced through all the references to prescription drugs, and the attempt to find some form of solace in God, even if it does feel kind of half-hearted. And yet on some level, I didn't even think this album would hold up well as evidence in a court of law, mostly because of how inconsistent, inarticulate, and scattershot it is. There are good ideas on the life of Pablo, but nowhere else in Kanye's career have the seams and the cracks in his persona and art feel so evident. It shows Kanye with the fewest lyrical ideas and consistent songs, a record whose hype has eclipsed both the music and to some extent Kanye himself, to the point where he has to take it back in order to provide him even more tinkering for it. And while I think Kanye knows that the hype has gotten away from him here, it would require a much defter touch than his to make potent music of this as a whole. And while I find it fascinating that Kanye says the Pablo is the title, it's not Pablo Escobar, it's not Pablo Picasso, it's actually St. Paul, which if you actually read St. Paul's letters in the Bible, a lot of those letters are rife with sloppy argumentation and blatant misogyny. Oh, the irony. For me, this is a 5 out of 10, and only recommended if you're in that select Kanye fan base. Otherwise, as much as I get the feeling that Kanye also kind of needs a little bit of help, I also get the feeling that he's not gonna get it until it's far too late. And that's the real sad thing. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yes, I can imagine this is going to be a bit of a controversial review since, yes, I'm reviewing this before Kanye took this back to do more revisions, presumably to re-release this album again. But honestly, once you release the album, dude, it's out there. It's gone. Major publications have dropped reviews for it. You can't just take it back and you want to fix it. As an artist myself, I've written a book here. Often one of the most painful things to let your own art out into the wilderness so that other people can resolve it and criticize it. But eventually, you gotta let it go, dude. I'm gonna hold Kanye to the same standard we'll hold everybody else, as is only fair. But otherwise, if there are any other albums you want me to cover, or anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.